And the first presentation comes from Emily Norton, who is a director, rural research at Savills. Emily's going to talk to us about sustainability, the sustainability journey. She's responsible for generating and guiding production of high quality insight commentary on rural property, agricultural policy and sustainability topics across England and Scotland. She's also 2018 Nuffield Scholar, which is fantastic, and a director of the Oxford Farming Conference for 2020 to 2023. So I'll hand over to you there. Thank you very much, Emily.
Karen, don't run away, because I just need to check that you can hear me.
I can hear you and I can see you.
Excellent, that's even better. What I now need to do is to share my screen. I've been having a hideous connectivity morning of trying to work this out, and so I'm working off a 4G hotspot, which is, everybody in the audience will know, is the least reliable way to share screens ever. So my sincere apologies. I will try my best to try and communicate all this to you. So while equally, I destroyed my work laptop in a water incident coming back from London the other week. So I'm doing all this off my Mac, which I'm quite unpracticed at. So I hope very much now that you can see the right thing.
I can see Dairy and the sustainability journey. Yes.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'm going to share a little bit about my background and how I've sort of come through the dairy sector and what I'm doing now, and in particular share some of the insights that I have discovered and enjoyed, and would like to share with you around how we communicate what we're doing within the dairy sector. So it's a bit wide ranging. It covers some sort of fairly out there topics, I think, but I hope will leave us with some sort of positive actions that we can do, particularly around this idea of communicating all of this stuff to consumers. So if I try and pass this on, my sustainability journey. Okay, so I was born and brought up in a small mixed dairy and arable farm in Norfolk. In 2004, I moved back to the farm and helped launch our family dairy business in 2007. I spent a huge amount of time talking to consumers, to schools, to people who visit the farm, about what they were thinking about what we were doing, all of the stuff around mixed farming and integrating cows into arable systems was sort of front and center of the role that I played on farm. I laughingly describe my job title as Director of Sales, Events and Distractions, because that's really what I did on the dairy side in particular. Had some success with our cheese, won some decent awards for that, which was really good. But actually this year we separated the family business because we got down to cousins level, and my cousins are taking over on the dairy side of the business. And so now I'm fully employed elsewhere and wish them every success for the future of their business. But all of those learnings, all of that experience, all of that thinking about these systems and why it wasn't working in the way that I felt it should be working, really led me into this sustainability journey. And eventually onto a Nuffield Scholarship, where you really have the opportunity to take a deep dive into what's going on with consumers, with our food systems, and the policy, the agricultural policy that supports them. Very privileged to have a role at Savills now, where I get to do this kind of thing and share some of those thoughts. So I went to Harper Adams in 2004 to study a master's in sustainability. So it's an understanding of what we really mean when we sort of think about sustainability. And back then, quite a bit about integrated pest management and kind of the LEAF system. But fundamentally, this idea that we were looking for this triple bottom line approach all the time. So people, planet, profit, or environmental, social governance, always these three things that balance the economic aspect with the social and the environmental aspect. And that was sort of then encapsulated in this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, proposed in 1992, finally fully adopted in 2015, and in theory to be implemented by 2030. You know, heaps of criticism around this though, likely to cost £2 to £3 trillion a year if we're really going to be serious about delivering on that kind of framework. And I think the issue and the fair issue is that it's not actually made a difference. Now, this is one of my favorite slides, and I got this back in 2004 when we were studying sustainability, and it basically shows that the use of the word sustainable is actually unsustainable. So on the basis of the trend of how often we're talking about these issues around sustainability, it says there by the year 2061, the word sustainable will occur at an average of 1 per sentence. You know, it's a Mickey tape, but actually it shows what the problem is here. It's such a bandied around term that we don't really know what we mean by it. And, you know, we'll come on to thinking about some of that stuff now, because it's critical if we are to address some of the challenges that we've got within our sector, that we really know what it is that we're talking about. Right. I've done quite a bit of Googling trying to pull this presentation together. And actually, I just put a very boring search term in, what's unsustainable about dairy farming. And you will know, because you're all, and I've heard some of the conversations you've been having about the activism that exists around our sector, that there is a heap of information out there criticizing it, pointing out that it's, you know, not fair, it's unsustainable, using again these terms around kind of the use of the animal within the systems that we put them there. And I think, let's be honest, we have got some issues across the sector as a whole, and the rise of veganism in particular shines a light of honesty on where we have got to. Now, I firmly believe it's not our fault, right? Farming is a product of the economic system that has pushed us towards consumerism and supermarket power as determinants of the overall value chain. And everything that we have done within our farming system is simply trying to keep up, not even stay ahead, just simply trying to keep up with where that pressure has been pushing us as a sector. But we know there are heaps of individual problems, from reliance on plastic bottles to excessive water use, you know, the issues over dairy bull carbs, antibiotic usage. We've got, you know, packages of things that are happening across the whole piece. But there's a general awareness, I think, that we can't keep continuing on this trajectory individually, maybe collectively as a system. The thing that really got us motivated, though, and this is where my journey into thinking about sustainability at farm level came from, was this idea of income, and it being not fair that farming cannot make a fair, decent return. Dairy farming can't make a decent return compared to other sectors. And it just felt unfair that we were doing that. So developing these ideas of on-farm sustainability became this general pressure behind the scenes, whether it was Retractor trying to look at supply chain assurance and adding value on farm, through to innovations like LeafMark. You know, since 2001, we've had this idea of supply chain assurance in order to drive better behaviours, in order to drive better returns to farm level for a very, very long time. And again, there's this idea that it's probably not working. We've simply not got far enough with the way that these labels are intended to drive different behaviours going forward. So what I found when I sort of was heavily involved in dairy farming, trying to market dairy produce directly from our farm, I then took a job advising a MP on European policy, and he recruited somebody specifically to have awareness, or he wanted somebody who had awareness of what was going on within the dairy sector, because it was such an issue at European level during the mid-10s, I should say, to 2014 in particular. And as you all remember, 2012, we all went to London and we campaigned about, you know, it not being fair, we weren't being paid enough. And of course, there were those innovations which came as a result. Morrison's promised to pay us fairly, Tesco started their dairy supplier group. But it was this getting active idea. We still have this total lack of negotiating power at farm level, the asymmetry of knowledge and terms between farmers and dairy contracts. Now, I really hope that some of that stuff in the Agriculture Act is going to be dealt with, and the Dairy Supply Code becomes a template by which we're enabled to negotiate fairly. And I think what I don't like, though, about this kind of thing is the perpetual state of crisis that we feel we need to exist in order to get our story across about why we're investable, why it's good. And I think that's really some of the underlying concerns in this space around how we can continue to communicate a positive story, an investable story, and an attractive story, for all of those reasons that have already been mentioned, about making sure that we get the right people to come and work in our sector in a way that provides meaningful and good careers on a long-term basis. So too much information, right? Out of all of this stuff, we absolutely don't know how to respond to managing all of those drivers at farm level, all of that food systems information, all of that purchasing behaviour, all of the mud that's thrown at the sector. What do we do with all of this information? So we'll look a little bit at that kind of stuff now. And I love this quote because it is really, really true. When you've got a very complex system, you've got to find the simple messages that enable people to act, to do something differently in order to retain value in the whole thing. So I'm going to be very brave. I'm going to share something with you that I worked on back when I was fully involved in selling dairy products. And it was this idea called Farming for Life. And life, you know, farmers love an acronym. It was about sustaining livelihoods, about developing innovation, about promoting food and promoting environment. And I put that little symbol on the side of our cheese boxes as if it would make a difference, right? Because I felt that those were the kind of values that I wanted people to be buying into when they thought about buying a dairy product from our farm. But it was a livelihood point that I thought was so critical, because in all of these sustainability conversations around environmental impact, we don't talk enough about the social impact and the social consequences of what's happening at farm level, and the drivers that are causing some of those issues to be so negative at farm level as well. But it really is this idea of making it simple for consumers. So, you know, if it's not this kind of label, then perhaps it's this kind of label. And sustainability as a value add option of consumers, like, you know, this is Dalesford's beautifully organic semi-skimmed milk, and this is kind of what I aspired to. I wanted that brand value to return value back to our farm, and in order to make it a sustainable living for everybody. But actually, have you thought about it, especially having done lots of research via our field and talking about the value of brands in returning sustainable value to dairy? I don't think that sustainability should be a value add option for consumers. I'm really actually troubled by the ethics of that sustainability shouldn't be a premium, it should be a given. I mean, this is the point here. What's the opposite of sustainable? It's actually unsustainable. And if it's unsustainable, should it basically be illegal or somehow regulated out of existence? Because you shouldn't be able to exist in a situation which doesn't do that, right? We all know this is the absolute problem. But of course, the issue is people need to eat. And it's the gap between what consumers say that they want and what they pay for that is the major issue, that value action gap, as they call it. The major issue in our food system sustains the cheap price of food as a social welfare policy tool. It's the simple fact of reality that, you know, government, the system, you know, the economics of the entire thing says that the price of food to the consumer is the sole determinant of whether supply chains are working effectively. It's why we can't, other than through perhaps producer organisations, negotiate to raise the price of milk in order to make better returns for consumers, because make better returns for farmers, because you are impacting negatively on the price of food to the consumer. So, you know, there's some fairly major systemic issues around our sector here that means that actually sustainability and charging a lot of money for the same product produced to a different basis becomes a value add proposition, as opposed to something that everybody can find accessible, because it does cost more. Now, I'm going to draw quite heavily on Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy throughout some of the rest of the presentation. He did tickle round the edges of some of these issues without ever really grappling with that question around why the price of food is sustained, and why people shouldn't be allowed to become better off in some means or the other to be able to access sustainability as a standard. And there's just so many issues there within that statement that drive me crazy. It shouldn't be an option, in my opinion, but perhaps that's the direction of travel that we need to think about. So what else is happening now in this labelling space? We've kind of got these ideas of brands and brands that sustain and add value. And we've also now got increasingly trying to simplify down the complexity of all of the information and all of the impacts that we know around food into simple food labelling systems. That carbon idea didn't work before because it didn't have enough context around it. This concept from an organisation called Foundation Earth has got some really interesting backing to it. Some pretty big businesses are really interested in the idea that they're developing around these eco-impact scores. Now, Mighty is a type of Ulka. It's got a missing it. You will note it's actually made from oats, but they've put their product through this assessment process, and you can see there how it's been graded against carbon, water usage, water pollution, and biodiversity and species loss. And it's been given an A. And in theory, what these guys want to do, you know, you can have any product graded through the system. I don't think conventional milk, as we know and love it, has been put through the system yet. But does it then allow consumers at the point of consumption, at the point of purchase, to make a sensible choice in order to, be able to compare the environmental value of different products side by side on the shelf, and does it matter? It's a super interesting question. I'm looking forward to getting these guys at the Oxford Farming Conference in January in order to be able to try and work out from their point of view whether this stuff is actually going to make a difference to consumer behaviour. But look, the drive and the focus on consumer behaviour is not optional, okay? There are these systems that I'm trying to make it more simple for them, but actually the pressure to change at consumer level is coming at policy level, right? Again, this little graph is from the National Food Strategy, and the National Food Strategy really talks about how can we change diet, how can we change people's dietary behaviour, buying behaviour in order to produce these different outcomes at farm level. And it looked at all the kind of current ways in which we use land. And this was one of, I mean, there's heaps of interesting graphs and stuff in there. I really advise you to go and have a look through. But it basically said if we increase crop yields by 15%, eat 30% less meat, then we need a third less land, which can then be released in order to meet these carbon and biodiversity challenges that we've got around the system. And Henry Dimbleby describes this as the route to having it all. Both those scenarios, so either a 30% or 50%, 40% reduction scenario, free up enough land, not just to achieve climate goals, to make space for nature, both in wilder areas and on our farms, without compromising our levels of food self-sufficiency. And so this is the point, all of these drivers, they're coming at us from every single direction, not just to change how we are acting as an industry, but particularly how consumers are eating food and how they're buying food. And I do think it's absolutely critical that we acknowledge this in order to say that change is inevitable, and standing still and being defensive about this situation is absolutely not an option. So what's happening at policy level in the UK? Some quite interesting stuff. And loads of colourful graphs out there at the moment. It's crazy, isn't it? So the Global Farm Metric, really interesting way of trying to standardise our understanding of what happens at farm level across a whole heap of indicators. And I think, I like this in some ways, but I don't think that it necessarily simplifies the problems of understanding and being able to compare different farm systems side by side. But it is interesting that they're trying to embed that level of thinking within how we evaluate policy and the way that policy is playing out as well, and how policy is judged going forward. The other thing, of course, within England specifically, at the moment, both Scotland and Wales are slightly further behind on the development of the detail of their farm policies. But farming as the future, the English policy in particular, the animal health and welfare pathway, it's looking at developing funding streams specifically to tackle that value action gap, so the gap between what consumers say that they want from our farmed animals and what they're prepared to pay for, or the way that cheap food is provided to them in a particular way. And I think that's really interesting to say, government acknowledges that there's a major gap here between that action and the demand for action, and then the way the food is priced, and is looking to fill that gap with policy money going forward. And I think that's quite an important thing to make sure that we're aware of, that schemes that are going to help deliver that and make those changes viable and embedded within our systems, we need to make sure we're asking for the right stuff of government. And government is very, very keen to co-design these things in England at the moment. So we need to make sure that we're clear and we're asking for the right things that are going to make a difference. Right, that is the national picture. Consumer stuff, complicated, policy emerging, all driving in the same direction, trying to change the way the farming is operating at ground level, right? But it's not just national issues that we're worried about. There are some pretty massive macroeconomic policy drivers around sustainability as well. And unless you're sleeping under a rock, you will be aware that COP26 this autumn is happening with this major focus on climate change and the massive changes that are needed around every sector of our economy across every country on the planet, in order to make sure that we don't end up on a very, very destructive pathway. So that these things are happening, that we cannot escape these things. This is not just about veganism. This is not just about consumer activism. This is about a sustained system of governance change around how we act and operate as businesses within a sector. And I think that's really important to acknowledge going forward, that these things are not going away, and this sense of crisis and urgency, they're really shining a light on these particular things. And what's annoying about this, in my mind, on one level is that the focus is only on carbon, at least in the short term. And I'm not going to get too much into the details of methane versus carbon. I'm sure it's been debated for a very, very long time. But, you know, it does not look good for the overall viability of some elements of how we do things at the moment. It's going to come under an increasing amount of scrutiny. And again, we cannot deny that these things are happening. We know that farming has got a problem. Since 2008, this is again, lovely graph, the National Food Strategy, we've decarbonised at less than half the pace of the wider economy. And it's stark there, mainly because agricultural emissions have not fallen at all, okay? We are known as one of the harder sectors to decarbonise. We've got a major problem and we need a major effort put into thinking about how we do this going forward. And it's no longer something that we can duck, okay? But the reason we can no longer duck it is not necessarily the reason that you might think. And it is because of this macro level stuff and the way that finance in particular is being regulated to change its carbon impact. So this really speaks to a corporate level issue. And you may think, oh, me as an individual farm, why is this a concern? You know, I don't really deal with corporates, but actually we all do. We know that the concentration both upstream, where we buy our inputs from, and downstream, who we sell our products to, and also the sectors that work around us are very, very concentrated, whereas as an industry, we're still relatively fragmented. So Treasury came forward with this green finance strategy, which talked about greening the finance sector, but it also came up with this thing called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So very boring, but basically the entire economy is expected to start disclosing its carbon impact by around 2025. So depending on which sector you're in, between 2022, next year, and 2025, all businesses are going to have to start disclosing certain impacts around the food system. So it's not just your impact in terms of your responsibility for certain climate outputs, it's also the risk that you have in terms of the climatic risk around where your finance is. So this means it's going to start impacting businesses, listed businesses, banks, landowners, large landowners, also insurance companies. All of these are going to have to start disclosing their climate impact and the risk that they have, the exposure that they have to climate and to climate events, water and carbon across a lot of sectors going forward. So do we need to be worried about this, right? Yes. Okay, disclosure drives corporate behavior. Now, this is a straightforward graph, but what it shows, where the dotted line is down the middle of that graph, was when the French government introduced a requirement on French businesses, listed businesses, to start disclosing the amount of money that they had invested in carbon-intensive industries. And half of the businesses were subjected to this requirement, and the other half weren't. And you can see from the blue line, the bottom line, those are the ones that had to disclose how much money they had invested in carbon intensive industries. And that was how much change there was. There was a clear divestment strategy. They took their money away from investing in carbon intensive industries and they put it into other places that did not have the same level of carbon impact. So this kind of behavior, if all of our listed businesses, our banks, our supply chains, our supermarkets, our insurance businesses, even the listed PLCs that are active in the sector start to disclose their carbon impact, it's going to be much, much more transparent as to where their emissions are coming from. And there is going to be much, much more pressure on us as a result to provide them with information that shows that we are making a difference and we are aware of these concerns, right? Okay. So there's some big picture stuff going on, and there's a huge push both at policy level, at consumer level, and also amongst the stakeholders that exist around agriculture, going to be a laser focus on us as an industry in order to get us to change our behaviours, okay? But we know that on many levels, we're already doing a good thing. We've got a lot of positive stories to tell, and we need to make sure that we keep getting those positive stories out there, okay? Now, how do we get these messages across? This is the bit that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, because there's some real resonance in how I hear people wanting to talk about what we're doing as a sector. And the thing on the right, I will share these slides with you. I know it's so tiny, but you can look for, it's all to do with cognitive bias, right? This is the shortcuts that our brains make when we've got too much information. And what we've got around the sector at the moment and all of the messages that are coming out, the competing messages, the problems, the different facts and the misinformation and the myths and everything. And we've got too much information. There's a lack of meaning and a lack of time in order to be able to make sense of all of this, because we're subjected to information from everywhere, you know, scrolling through our phones. And that means our brains start to make shortcuts. And the shortcuts that we start to make are things like confirmation bias, where we're more likely to believe something that we already believe to be true. So that's, you know, mud sticks, basically, you know, no smoke without fire, all of those kind of metaphors around we're just more likely to believe things if they've got that sort of essence of truth about them that kind of sort of confirm what we already thought or believed. And the other one is this major sort of cognitive bias, which is this tendency to simplify. We can't hold nuance in our brain. There's too many competing pieces of information. So we just go straight to a shorter narrative that suits what we already know. And this is why, and I'll go through this in some detail now, stories are so powerful, because they use those shortcuts and they use metaphors and things that people are familiar with in order to reduce the complexity and enable people to latch on to more complex ideas in a way that makes sense for them. And it's all about playing out this narrative and finding a narrative that really works for the story that we need to take people on. Right, this is a complicated slide, I'm sorry, but I wanted to set it out for you, okay? There's this amazing book by a guy called Christopher Booker, and it's called 7 Basic Plots. And what he has done, amazingly, is go through pretty much every story, every movie, every plot line ever, and said that there are fundamentally 7 different stories there, okay? And they're in the column on the left. So you've got things like Overcoming the Monster, which is, you know, David and Goliath, Jaws, James Bond. You know, we know this plot line, it's really familiar to us. Also, Rags to Riches, again, we know it, Slumdog Millionaire, Cinderella, these stories where you start with nothing and then become rich and famous and fabulous. The Quest, again, Lord of the Rings, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Voyage and Return, things like The Wizard of Oz, Peter Pan. Comedy includes anything to do with romance, okay? So Mamma Mia, Tangled, Pride and Prejudice. So it's that kind of traditional sense of comedy, which would include those love stories as well. Tragedy, again, very familiar, The Hunger Games, Romeo and Juliet. We know these, you know, they're all familiar to us, these plot lines. And when you begin to recognize them, you begin to see how much they repeat in the narratives that we're given, in the books that we read, the TV programs that we watch, you know. And Rebirth is the final one, The Sleeping Beauty, The Lion King. They're all very, very familiar to us, right? Now, those stories work, they work in narratives, they also work in advertising. They work in the branding that we are given that sit around our industry. And so you can see, my opinion, Overcoming the Monster is how the organic sector decided to promote itself as being anti-pesticide, anti-corporations, you know, against this big brother, against the evil corporate, yeah? And it's the same thing with the anti-GM movement, you know, fearing something, fearing the monster, and telling that David and Goliath story of how you overcame it. Rags to Riches is the same. All of these kind of, like, you know, great stories we get coming out of the food sector and disruptor brands, you know, the Oatleys of the world, you know, they were disruptor brands because they're taking on the might of the meat industry or the dairy sector. Yeah, that's why people believe in them. But also this idea of aspiration and how you can aspire to luxury and through the foods that you eat, and they can take you there to those luxury places, okay? So I've put there on the right sort of kind of examples from food, examples from farming, these narratives that we tell in order to explain the story, and how they connect back to these fundamental basic narratives that people believe and resonate, and kind of they go, oh yeah, that's familiar, I get that, I get what we're talking about there, okay? Now the 3 important ones are the 3 at the bottom, in my opinion: comedy, tragedy, and rebirth, because I think those are the 3 narratives we most often tell ourselves about what we're doing in the farming sector. And I would say the first one would be tragedy. I would say this is anything that says you should buy British, you should buy local, and anything that's kind of against the industry, as in that originally where it says ... was something really offensive about dairy farmers, but I didn't want to write it down. But you know this abuse, you've been given this abuse, okay? You know, it's a tragedy what we are doing as an industry. Of course it's not, you know, we know that that's the counter narrative. But also when we say you should buy British, you know, why should we buy British? It's kind of guilting people into feeling that they should explain these behaviours. And it's also the bit where we discredit other sectors, you know, almonds are evil too. It's kind of it's a story, it's a negative story. The problem with negative stories is you have to keep telling them. And that's why the tactic of the vegan sector in particular is to repeat that story again and again and again, because the further you are away from the source of the guilt and the thing that's making you feel guilty, the much more likely you are to do anything about it. And this is really explains what I was saying earlier about the value action gap, the bit where consumers say they will definitely do something, and then they go into the supermarket and they do something completely different. So I don't like this idea of kind of making people feel sorry for farming and that we deserve support. I don't like that narrative. I don't think it's a good long-term narrative. And I think we need something more optimistic, more positive. As much as you would think that Love British Food was a positive narrative, I don't think that it's necessarily the right kind of nuance that we need to be telling going forward. So a different story would be romance and this idea of love and the idea of family. Okay, and again, you just realize how often we tell ourselves stories about the power and the value of family within dairy farming and farming in general within the UK. And Prince Charles is our biggest advocate from this perspective. He is the one person who's trying to champion this idea of family farming being at the heart of sustainable farming in general and a sustainable future. And on one level, I get it, okay? Family farming is great. In theory, families have values, they care, they look after each other, and therefore, by extension, we're looking after the environment, we're looking after the animals in our care. In reality, I don't think it's defensible, okay? I don't think it's defensible in policy terms anymore. Simply being a family farm does not guarantee you a right to exist anymore. It may have been something that was possibly more relevant under the Common Agricultural Policy and this idea of the right to have an income from farming. But I think for lots of interesting reasons, lots of nuances, we are moving away from this idea that simply inheriting a farm is the right way to farm and makes you a good farmer, right? The idea of this impacts on new entrants, okay? How do we begin to enable the right kind of people to come into our sector if land, if opportunity, if businesses are locked up in multi-generational businesses who, you know, your next generation may not be the right people to take your farm on? How do we know, how can we be absolutely confident to say that family is the right thing going forward? And I'm not sure we can. I get it. I do understand that there's a huge amount of romance and love and all of those ideas, which are strong and powerful, but I'm just not sure that it's necessarily the right thing we should be throwing back if we feel under threat. So, you know, we're a family farm and therefore it's all going to be okay. And I think, again, that's a bit of a nuance that we need to think about going forward in terms of how we counter things that aren't necessarily what we agree with. So the great white hope of farming in the UK at the moment, as you know, sustainable dairying in particular, is this idea of which pins to the rebirth narrative of regenerative dairy, regenerative farming. And we hear it absolutely everywhere, from investors at the highest level to banks to Arla. You know, there is a huge amount of interest being put into this holy grail, the holy grail of solving the conundrum of food production at a decent yield, profit, and carbon sequestration and biodiversity enhancement as well. And I think this is possibly good. I have some major concerns about it and how we kind of sustain the narrative of rebirth. You can't keep being reborn. You have to have this as a long-term purpose. Okay, like, how is this going to take us into our future? The definition of being a regenerative business is that you are creating more economic, social, and natural capital than you're consuming. And I like that as a purpose. And yeah, if we don't use this kind of narrative to take us beyond our own farm gates and start to change the system that exists around us, in particular into that consumption paradigm, then I don't think it's going to be effective. And I wrote a blog on this just the other week, which talks about kind of that rebirth idea as Groundhog Day. You know, we're going exactly through the same cycle of rebirth and destruction every day, and it never really gets us anywhere. We never break the cycle that kind of pins us down, versus kind of, you know, the Lion King idea of, you know, Simba coming back and it's great and everything's in balance and the whole thing's beautiful and going forward. You know, we're stuck in this idea of what we want it to be, but if we don't reach out beyond the farm gate and start kind of pushing this idea of regeneration into the broader systems that sit around us, it's not going to be successful. So the question, I think, is really, is your milk buyer regenerative? Are they operating a regenerative business? Is your bank operating a regenerative business? Are they creating more economic, social, and environmental capital they're consuming? And is your landlord, if you're a tenant, you're renting land, how are you influencing other people in order to make sure that these changes and these positive changes are sustained, rather than something that is just there and available to be extracted from farming again going forward? All right. So final slides, just to finish this all off and try and give us individually as farmers within our own systems a way of thinking about these pressures that are coming down onto our farms. Okay, so this I love triangles, shapes, whatever. It's the way of making sense of it from my mind. Okay, at the top of the triangle has to be your business strategy, so who you are as a farm, what your personal priorities are. Okay, some of that can be voluntary, so it might speak to your brand and the kind of thoughts you want to put into your brand. And some of it might be driven by compliance. Okay, so what your bank is asking you to disclose in terms of carbon impact, or what the basic payment scheme or a government scheme is asking you to disclose in the kind of compliance system that sits around it. Okay, so that has to sit at the top and it has to overarch everything. Okay, now beneath that there's this new layer of policy drivers and market drivers. And I have had so many arguments with farmers about when they're going to be paid to store carbon within their farms, right? And that's an outward looking market opportunity. And if we were going to do that, we would need to have some mechanisms that sit within the middle there that says, how do we account for those particular elements and those particular opportunities? So policy might ask us to have some stuff. We might have voluntary opportunities to do some stuff. Our supply chains might be asking us to disclose certain information as well. And all of those different strands would all sit within that middle level because they're all quite prescriptive and we would have to comply with them. And then at the bottom, right, is the information, it's the data. Now there is data all over dairy farms, as you know. Every single system, every piece of record keeping that you are doing has to kind of be backed by information, and that information is increasingly valuable in terms of communicating the kind of pieces of information they're going to speak to those policy drivers in those markets, and then fundamentally make sense to us as businesses in terms of how we keep the data manageable. And this is absolutely the point that I want to get across. Again, I've had so many conversations with rural businesses, with farmers, and they say, look, we want to be net zero, okay? And they think about, we want to be net zero. And I say, why? Why do you want to be net zero? Okay, but you have to ask the question why, because otherwise you don't know which information you need to collect in order to meet those opportunities. If you want to be net zero because your milk buyer is telling you to be net zero, you need to speak to them about what their requirements are. If you want to be net zero on your own basis and use a bigger footprint or a different way of measuring it or a different system of metrics, you can. There may be overlap, but there may not. And this is the core challenge we've got going forward. Governments, the current government, want us to be the individual determinants of the success of our own businesses. We're not going to have one master anymore. We're effectively going to be our own masters and able to speak to all of these different dynamics, all of these different opportunities around whether it's selling sustainability as a service or whether we want to be sustainable in our own right. Okay, so making sense of that strategy. What do we need at the top in order to make sense of all of the different systems, all of the different drivers, and then what information do we need? Ideally, you collect information once and you use it in lots of different ways to add value. Yeah, and those are the different routes that you can go down. But think about the overall governance, the overall strategy that you have in terms of selling sustainability as a service or being sustainable before you say we're going to, stick all of our eggs into one particular basket, and driving those outcomes from that perspective. So I wanted to end on a high because I just think this is really, this gives me a real sense of optimism, right? When I used to do tours around our dairy farm and you'd get kids onto farm and they would always ask the same questions, okay? They would always kind of say certain things, or teachers did as well. And one of the first things that people would challenge you on is, why do you take the carbs away at birth? It's cruel. Yeah, no, that's not nice. It's not a nice thing to do. And you can explain it till, again, the cows come home. It's the least cool way of doing it. It's acknowledged to be, if you let them stay together, then they form too much of a bond, and it's, off we go, right? We know now that there are people out there who are innovating in how you can keep cows and calves together on a longer term basis. And they're not just micro dairies. Again, this is a major project in order to work out how you can do this kind of system at scale. And challenging those conventions that we give ourselves about how we do things, I think is really, really important. And this one I picked up in the Irish Farmers Journal just yesterday, and it just made me laugh. Because again, we would have the kids standing there and inevitably somebody cow would come stand right in front of you and crap all over your shoes, right? And we would always go, you can't house train a cow. They're not as clever as a dog, right? You can house train your dog. Where does your dog go to the toilet? You taught it to do that. But actually, there's some German scientists who are teaching calves where to wee. And obviously we know, because if you mix the urine and the poo together, it creates more of an environmental impact than if you separate it. So maybe we can house train calves. We just never bothered to think about it. So I just, I like this. I like the optimism in saying some of those conventions that we give ourselves, some of those pressures that we put ourselves under, and those things that consumers don't like about our system, maybe we can think positively about them and find a different way of doing it that keeps everybody happy. That is me done. That is 35 minutes of me talking, and I'm so sorry. I hope it was useful. I hope I didn't go through it too quickly. And I hope there's some interesting comments, shouts, whatever, in the chat that we can get to. Emily.
Hi. Thank you so much, Emily. That was, wow, I mean, a lot to take in, a lot to think about. But I think we have got some really good questions, and yeah, we'll if you're able to, we'll share your slides out afterwards, and obviously we're going to put a recording of this up online for anyone who wants to have a rewatch next week, because I think it's definitely a session that I would need to go back through again just to be able to take it all in, because like I say, just so much to think about. But we have got some questions. So Amy asked what the name of the book was that you referenced with the 7 themes in.
Sorry, I've just muted myself. I'll put it in the chat. It's by Christopher Booker, and it's called The 7 Basic Plotlines.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Alison Howie said, so refreshing hearing your opinions on this. Unfortunately, there is a huge focus on the family farm and buy British picture rather than getting highly skilled individuals able to access farming jobs and make the changes at the rate of change needed to ensure the future and development of British farming.
Yeah, I mean, great observation. And I think, I don't know, I cringe. It's these things that you're so kind of embedded in this idea that family farming is great. And I've been there and I've defended family farming because that's my heritage, that's my pedigree. But actually, my grandfather was a farm labourer. He fought in the First World War. He came back, he bought his first farm, he bought another farm, he then got another farm, and then we became a family farm because we stayed in one place. And I think actually that's the interesting thing. We've now evolved that, cousins have got that farm, parents and I will move on somewhere else. And I think you've got to keep evolving, and we get overly fixated on this idea of ownership, and it is exclusionary to other people. It is basically saying, there's no value in doing this unless you've got property rights that go with it. And I think the more that we can innovate, the more that we can show that there are pathways to share farming or joint ventures or innovative models where kind of capital can meet skills, can provide really good employment opportunities for lots of people. And I do think dairy farming is probably one of the easiest things to do that on, because there's so many opportunities to get people involved at lots of different levels. And I think some of those examples are really great, and I kind of encourage that. I don't want to knock family farming, but I'm so uncomfortable when people use it as a reason to defend the status quo rather than saying, there are alternatives and we can work on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. Isabel said, hello, what does Emily think of the many, many different ways there are of measuring carbon on farm? Our audit is different to other farms and there is no sequestration accounted for. If we are to improve, how can we, if what is being measured is with different metrics?
Oh my gosh, it is the can of worms. It is carbon calculators. Yeah, it's a nightmare. I suppose in many ways, like one way to think about it is about consistency. Okay, so the worst thing you can do is use the Cool Farm tool one year and then the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit the next year, because you will never know whether you've made an improvement. Yeah, you need to do your research, find out which tool is best for you, which one maybe gives you access, like I was just saying about that triangle, the data requirements of this stuff are really critical. Which one kind of suits your current system of keeping information and where you're going to access that information, and how complicated it is to fill it in, and then stick with it. And stick with it to track your progress as and until somebody says to you, okay, now this is the tool that we want you to use, this is the preferred tool for whatever reason, then there might be a standardized tool. I think the worst thing you can do is wait for there to be complete alignment on these things. The best thing you can do is A, to start, and B, to be consistent, and then be honest with yourself. But I do think there are some interesting issues within that space that we're very hung up on. And the point about sequestration is a key one. What are we sequestering? Where? What are we going to get rewarded for it? There is just so many issues with those concepts that I think the best thing you can do is to think about the co-benefits of using carbon thinking to drive efficiencies in your system that help the overall value of the business. Yeah, so that might be reducing artificial inputs and getting better use of grass, for example. You know, it's thinking of those co-benefits as the key option.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah said, I would love to know Emily's opinion on carbon audits too. They seem the first indication of sustainability on farm. So we've just touched on that, really, haven't we? And then,
well, I think also, but I do think that that's the oddest thing about the current paradigm that we're in, because at global level, carbon has become the metric of interest, but it means that all of the other things that are harder to measure get forgotten. And I think as an industry, we need to make sure that we are communicating those things. Otherwise, we will only get judged by carbon. And there is a big danger for the livestock sector if carbon is the only factor of relevance. So, you know, that's why the stories are so important, because all of that nuance, all of that complexity gets lost if we're just looking at it through a single metric of carbon. And telling a story of regenerative farming, if that's the story that we want to tell, about giving back across lots of different categories rather than just one, becomes more important, and that speaks into the social piece as well.
Yeah. Kelly said, sorry, my screen's gone a bit funny and some of the messages have gone a bit strange for me, but anyway, Kelly said, whilst we are completely on board and engaged with the carbon footprint idea and model, we feel strongly that it's being used by the companies carrying it out for our milk buyer as a selling tool over a useful tool for improvement.
Yeah, okay. So this, I think, is a really interesting point. And with my, the anecdote I would use forevermore in this is a conversation I had with a landowner, a private landowner, so Lord somebody or the other, a dairy farmer who was a tenant of his. And he was a tenant and he was supplying milk, dairy farmer, to Arla. And we were having this kind of like, you know, interesting conversation about the future of what was going on within that piece. And the owner of the land was basically saying, oh, well, you know, I think I need to be net zero as a business. So I've got some property investments and I've got, you know, this tourism venture and, you know, this and this. And, you know, we've obviously got the let farmland, but we own the soil. So that's going to be our carbon that's stored within there. And there you go. But obviously the tenant dairy farmer was saying, well, we're providing all of this carbon information to our supply chain because the supply chain wants to be net zero, and they're asking us to do some tree planting and do some offsetting. And he also then said, well, I'm going to be paid to the carbon that I'm storing and sequestering within my farm as well. And I could just see this really interesting power dynamic between what the owner was expecting from carbon, what Arla, and by extension every supermarket listed business under the sun is expecting from carbon, and what the farmer in the middle was expecting to be their outcome from managing carbon. And I think it's a massive issue because government is incentivizing the development of private markets for carbon in order to supplement farmer incomes, in order to say this is a viable additional thing that you could be selling from your farm. And so we're sort of being encouraged to think about it, but without understanding the power dynamics that are already out there, that means that farmers already are in the worst negotiating position against these other powerful stakeholders. And so I've, with my Oxford Farming Conference hackathon, have commissioned a piece of research on kind of the ethics of this, the power dynamics of this, which will be presented at the Oxford Farming Conference in January, because I think it's such a critical issue and nobody is talking about it, about what it actually means. And you know, farmers are going around, it'd be great, we're going to be paid for carbon, but actually no, your supply chain is going to say what they want you to do, and they're likely to take the carbon because they've got the power at the end of the day, haven't they? And equally, if your land is owned by somebody other than you, then they're going to want the carbon. And I just think it's so important that we are aware of those issues and those power dynamics. And that's the core piece about that triangle, about that strategy that sits at the top of it. You've got to be laser clear about what you're doing for your own business, what you're doing for somebody else's business, and what information you're going to be asked for. And I think that's the overall picture that I really want to get across today, is that not just to kind of see these piecemeal opportunities, but say, what do I need to make my business sustainable long term?
I think that's really interesting, and it'll be really interesting to see that report when it comes out in January next year. So definitely we'll be hoping that we can share that with everybody after Oxford, which will be here before we know it, won't it? It'll suddenly come hurtling around the corner. Let's have a look. Other questions we've had. Let's have a look. Hannah Reef said, do you think social media campaigns need to promote how farmers are acknowledging carbon on farms and educate the public on why they're paying for sustainability, and explain how they've adapted farming practices, rather than often reading backhanded posts on social media when battling against the public?
It is a fascinating question, and having been targeted by vegan activists online, it's almost like, well, why would you bother? You just wouldn't bother. It's nobody's game. I think there is a strong point here though about you're not trying to communicate with the people who've already made up their minds. They've already made up their minds. What you're trying to do is communicate with the people who maybe don't know, and make sure that there is balanced information out there, and that it's done in a way that's accessible. But I do think a picture tells 1,000 words, and what consumers want to see, what consumers expect to see, all of those perceptions are changing. And if that's what we use some of that public money to invest in order to make sure that we're exceeding that, even though the price of food doesn't cover it, then I think that's important that we understand what we're targeting and where. It's nobody's job within this industry to convert anybody about the merits of anything. We give all of the power, all of the value to third parties to create brands. It should be the Lurpaks of the world who are engaged in this kind of thinking, and actually we do what we do in a really good way. And I do think that that's a little bit, sometimes we're defensive on behalf of our industry without realizing that the true value in protecting consumer interests is somewhere else, and I think maybe working with those people more to leverage the marketing budgets that they have got and understand these messages and how they do them would be better. But we tend to be very defensive and see it as a we. I always do this, like, we the industry. I mean, what do we mean by we the industry? I'm not defending all of the industry. I think there's certain bits of the industry that I'd be very happy to never have to visit ever. I just shouldn't exist. But I know also there's lots of really brilliant dairy farms that are doing the right thing and are sort of championing these causes and these issues. And I think sometimes when we say we the industry, we don't really mean it. Well, I certainly don't. And I think maybe we need to be more honest about that, about bringing everybody with us.
That's a really interesting point, and like you say about we're a lot of the time we're relying on the farmers on the ground to be counteracting that narrative on social media, whereas actually how much do we see coming down from those big brands with those huge marketing budgets as well? So yeah, really interesting point. We've got time for another couple of questions. So we've got Rebecca Shepherd said, really interesting discussion about family farming. As a farmer's daughter recently returned to the family farm, I definitely don't necessarily consider myself to be the best person to take the farm into the future. I'm certainly keen to explore joint venture, share farming options and work with new entrants.
I mean, what can we say? I mean, it's so it was made very, and actually it's a really personal audience to share this with. It was made very clear to me very early on that I wasn't as good as I could be because I wasn't a boy. And I think, I remember my uncle saying that to me. It's such a shame you weren't born a boy. And I think, from that moment on, you go, well, how else could I do this? I can't pick that up. That's not a small gate, that's a heavy gate. All of these sort of structural things around the industry that have been masculinized over the years, and just to go, do you know what, let's challenge those conventions too. It's all sort of, I remember taking, I tried to take a hose pipe to the calf shed so we didn't have to carry buckets of water around anymore. And it never got used, it never got installed. And I'm like, well, maybe I should have been there more and just installed a hose pipe so we could fill calf buckets up from a hose pipe rather than lugging heavy buckets around. But you know, it's just challenge convention and go for it. So yeah, completely right. Joint ventures, partnerships, find the right people to help you. It's not all on you. It's all about finding the right team to take.
Brilliant. And I think that's a really crucial point, isn't it? And you know, it draws in what all the other presentations have said today in terms of finding the right team, making the most of the people around you, like Kath was talking about earlier, and like Rachel and Susie spoke about, you know, communication, working together, knowing, like Kath mentioned, with the personality traits, looking at your strengths and weaknesses, and then those that aren't, you know, and accepting that you can't do it all as much as we'd all love to. You just can't. And yeah, knowing when to say, actually, I need, as Kath said, as Rachel said, work with the best. And if you're not the best at it, then find the person who is. Emily, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for making the time to join us.